The Cell arc is a contentious one amongst many. It is indeed less consistent in quality than most of what came before, even if the same can be said of the Frieza arc too to a lesser extent, though is just as much a victim of misinformation when it comes to critiques towards it, such as misunderstandings on character motivations, the lack of role the Room of Spirit and Time played prior, or how artificial humans created on Earth could surpass the strongest being in the Northern Quadrant. To only focus on one misunderstood idea worth giving some praise, it makes sense for it to be on the mechanics of time travel introduced in the arc, with it being the device which dictates the direction the plot goes until Cell is fully revealed, and being easily the most complex part of the arc in need of clarification. Before discussing the mechanics of it, I think it's worth pointing out how time travel works well here as a narrative tool, and would say the direction taken with it is amongst the better premises for time travel. The two main problems that make poor displays of time travel one of the most egregious plot devices is the convenience and consequences, or lack thereof with the latter. Poor displays of it result in it being a quick fix for problems, and even attempts to mitigate it can result in insufficient explanations to hand-wave it away when it served its purpose. Toriyama had the common sense to not let this be the case though, with not only the timeline splitting making it so that time travel quickly stops fixing events, but escalates the threat with Cell. On top of that, it adds a poetic quality to the narrative, with the death of a one-armed Gohan in one timeline that made the time machine necessary, results in another Gohan, only capable of using one arm, destroying the end result of both Gero's machinations and Trunks' time travel. As an idea, it already utilises its thematic and consequential matters far better than most. Now, onto its mechanical coherency. You may remember from the last video that there's a post hoc explanation for it, and that can be found within the Dragon Ball Super manga, in which chapter 14 reveals an important piece of information. If this was merely a cheaper retcon, as much of Super is, I wouldn't touch such a thing, but this piece of information seems to simply add extra clarification on what was already revealed in the manga. Simply put, performing an event that results in a paradox, such as leading to a parent's death before one's birth, is what causes a timeline to split, and for major changes to occur because of this. Looking at the events of the original manga, we can see how this plays out. The Daizenshu lists 4 main histories as a result of the arc's time travel. The presentation itself isn't exactly perfect within it, but we can see a consistent line going by what Super has clarified. We start with History 3. Trunks preventing Goku's death by giving him the heart medicine creates a paradox and splits the timeline into one similar to History 1, the main timeline we follow, and History 3, as Goku cannot be alive in one when he dies in the other. As an example of what doesn't cause a paradox, Trunks' return to the past and aiding in the fight against the Jinzo Ningen the next time we see him does not cause a paradox, as he is now travelling to a point 3 years into the future of History 1, rather than purely his own past. Upon his second arrival, it becomes apparent things have already changed, with Jinzo Ningen 19 and 20 being the ones to attack South City, rather than 17 and 18 unlike his timeline. We'll address that a little later. Obviously, Cell's events at this point in time can't occur without him going back in time, so the steps leading to the end result of History 3 are less concrete, but there is much to piece together. We know 17 and 18 were the ones to cause havoc, and 16 was never activated. We know Trunks somehow defeated 17 and 18 despite being weaker than Cell, who in turn has yet to surpass those two. We also know that Trunks programmed the time machine Cell used to go back in time, to age 763. This is important as, despite some proposing Cell's appearance didn't cause a paradox until Trunks saw the photo of the time machine, the Trunks of History 3 was unaware that going back further to change things would only create a separate timeline. But if Trunks did obviously use the shutdown remote on 17 and 18 in History 3, there's a problem, as Gohan's question has Trunks realised travelling further to the past won't change things. A lot of the events beforehand also lead into the timeline having been thrown off by Cell and Trunks. We'll go into how Cell's appearance in the timeline even before he was active creates a paradox soon, as we explore what we'll dub as History 4, though more as a placeholder than validating the Daizenshu. Assuming 19 and 20 being present at South City was exclusive to History 1 after Cell's arrival, for reasons we'll get into soon, things flow coherently with assumptions being logical ones rather than reaches. Gero was the reason for Buruma needing Karin back to Capsule Corporation, and Gohan being absent from the fight. If Gohan is in a different place and Buruma tells the Dragon Team about Gero's lab prior to Trunks destroying it, finding the basement and not discussing time travel would lead to Trunks going back to History 3 for his mother to create the remote only to be killed by Cell, and for the latter to solidify History 1's unique aspects. Obviously, there are many questions to ask on why History 1 was thrown off compared to Cell's timeline of History 3, or the History 2 timeline created by Trunks performing Shugyo in History 1 and returned home with newfound strength at a point in the timeline before Cell killed him, such as why 1920 appeared instead of 17 and 18, or why 16 wasn't released in Histories 2 and 3. Though just answering with Cell may feel cheap, it makes sense due to the paradox in Trunks' events in the past. Facilitating Cell going back further in time would create a paradoxical infinite loop, and subtle changes would need to occur to avoid this, particularly surrounding Cell and those linked to him. Though assumptive, realizing this allows for very logical answers to important questions without reaching beyond what the manga provides. Why did 1920 appear instead of 17 and 18? Why were History 1's 17 and 18 stronger than those of Histories 2 and 3? The answers to both are linked. We are told in Chapter 367's guide on the Jinzo Ningen that 18's power was limited compared to 17's in History 1. It stands to reason the Gero of both future histories chose to limit both their power to a greater degree and focused more on attempting to fix their disobedience, rather than moving on with 19, who was necessary to make him into Jinzo Ningen 20. Considering 16 wasn't present in the main lab in the future timelines for 17 and 18 to awaken him, it makes sense he was where he was in History 1 due to Gero looking back at purely mechanical Jinzo Ningen when designing 19. But what about 17 and 18 being evil in the future timelines? This being the common question shows many overlooking the obvious in the History 1 versions of them trying to kill a bedridden Goku purely for fun rather than out of their programming, or 17 being willing to kill Piccolo if the latter didn't cooperate with him. Directionless versions of them killing the Dragon Team that interrupted their fun is very consistent with their characterization, and their future timeline selves' main difference is that they were in a scenario where they got the opportunity to kill and thereby found fun in it. After that, there's one major question being, how does Trunks mention 1920 in the manga? And the answer is far from solid. It's not impossible, and it's questionable for it to be a pure mistake when considering Toriyama reread the manga in preparation for the Kanzenban release, and fixed minor errors found there. It's worth noting that neither Gohan nor Trunks name either of the Jinzo Ningen pair specifically in the events of the Trunks' story chapter. So it could be that attempts to research them caused Trunks to come across plans for 1920 and simply found out he was mistaken in identifying the twins as them between the first and second trip back in time, but that's honestly over-assumptive, and I prefer the anime's approach of simply removing the direct reference to their names when he told Goku. As for the Daizenshu's timeline and History 4's validity, it's difficult to argue for. The line of reason on there needing to be a timeline to facilitate Trunks being killed by Cell and avoid further paradoxes obviously makes sense, but the rationale of this being a timeline with a Cell game where Trunks left with the blueprints rather than staying to fight Cell doesn't work. Obviously, the timeline that the History 3 Trunks went to can't have a time-traveling Cell, and even though the scenario of a Trunks in a similar place as he was in History 1 leaving rather than staying for everything involving Cell is possible, it's about as significant of a divergence as any what-if scenario, and far from what the Daizenshu should have focused on. As an additional clarification, I'd also like to bring up the point I hear some throw around that History 3 makes no sense due to Trunks killing Frieza in it, and this point shows how much misinformation and inability to judge what is said permeates throughout the fandom. At no point in either the manga nor anime does Cell state he was referencing when Trunks came back in time in History 1. rather than just at any point when Trunks was around as the significant last warrior facing the Shinzo Ningen. The images of Frieza in cold being as Trunks killed them is purely for the simplicity of Toriyama not having to draw a new image, nor of Toei having to animate a new scene, which is telling when Trunks isn't even shown in Cell's monologue in the manga. To summarise, is Dragon Ball's approach to time travel perfect? No. Far from it. There are still many events where you have to make logical assumptions as to subtle changes in the timeline. However, it is still more than simply the butterfly effect altering the plot at a moment's notice, with the reveal of Cell and how paradoxes create alternate timelines helping tie things together, at least somewhat cohesively, especially considering how far messier other attempts at time travel can be, or how well Toriyama handled the complex concept that he made up as he went along. Moving away from a commendable but imperfect execution, ironic for the Cell arc, the final video in this series will go over the misunderstandings on what was in fact the perfect way to conclude the manga.